Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Today, we're going into the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, specifically into the rugged terrain of the Cascade Range in Washington State. This is a place where the trees are so thick they seem to swallow the light, and where the silence isn't just an absence of noise, it's a presence. But the story we're telling today isn't about a hiker getting lost or a legendary creature in the brush. It's about something far more unsettling. It's about a man named James, a retired civil engineer who spent his entire career looking at blueprints and topographical maps. He was a man of logic, a man of hard lines, and absolute measurements. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in magic. Until he found the map. The discovery at the estate sale. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the fog hangs low and heavy, clinging to the damp pavement. James was at an estate sale in a sleepy suburb of Seattle. The house belonged to a man who had passed away at the age of 98, a former surveyor for the United States Geological Survey. In the back of a dusty garage, tucked inside a weathered leather tube, James found it. It was a hand-drawn map dated 1954. At first glance, it looked like a standard topographical survey of a region known as the Dark Divide. But as James unrolled it on his dining room table that evening, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the map, nestled between two well-known peaks, was a valley. It was labeled the Shimmering Basin. James knew this area like the back of his hand. He had hiked it, surveyed it, and studied the satellite imagery for decades. The problem: there is no basin between those two peaks. In reality, those two mountains are connected by a sheer, impassable granite ridge. There is no valley. There is no basin. There is only a wall of rock. And yet, the map was incredibly detailed. It showed specific elevations, the winding path of a creek named Sorrow's Run, and a small cluster of structures marked as the settlement. James assumed it was a trap street, a fake entry cartographers sometimes use to catch people infringing on their copyright. But this wasn't a commercial map, it was a private, hand-penciled surveyor's log. The first inconsistency. James couldn't let it go. He spent the next 3 days comparing the 1954 map to modern GPS data. Logic told him the old surveyor had simply made a mistake. Maybe he was tired, maybe the weather was bad, and he hallucinated a valley where there was a mountain. But then, James looked closer at the handwriting. Beside the creek, there were tiny notes written in a frantic, shaky script. One note read, "The birds here don't fly, they only fall." Another note near the settlement said, "Time is 4 minutes slower," by the well. For a man like James, this was nonsense. But for a man with a lot of time on his hands and a lingering sense of adventure, it was a challenge. He decided he was going to find this non-existent place. He packed his gear, took his compass, and headed for the trailhead of the Dark Divide. Into the void. The hike was brutal. By the second day, James reached the base of the granite ridge, where the map claimed the entrance to the basin should be. He stood there, looking at a wall of stone that rose 3,000 feet into the air. There was no gap, there was no pass. James laughed to himself, feeling like a fool. He turned to leave, but then he looked down at the map one more time. He realized he was standing exactly where the map showed a trail called the Needle's Eye. According to the paper in his hand, the entrance wasn't through the mountain, but behind a specific outcrop of hemlock trees. He pushed through a dense thicket of old-growth forest, expecting to hit more rock. Instead, the air suddenly turned incredibly cold. His breath hitched in his chest as the temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single step. He stepped through the trees and stopped. The granite wall was gone. In its place was a narrow, winding canyon that seemed to fold into the earth. It defied every law of geology James knew. Looking up, the sky wasn't the gray-blue of a Washington afternoon. It was a deep, bruised purple, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. The Shimmering Basin. James walked for what felt like hours, though his watch seemed to have stopped. The hands were twitching back and forth between 12 and 1, never moving forward. Eventually, the canyon opened up into a valley. It was the shimmering basin, but it didn't look like nature. The trees were translucent, their leaves vibrating with a low hum. The creek, Sorrow's Run, flowed uphill in some sections, the water moving with a viscous, honey-like consistency. And then he saw them. The settlement. There were about a dozen cabins made of a wood that looked like polished bone. There was no smoke in the chimneys. There were no sounds of dogs barking or people talking. There was only the hum of the trees. James approached the central cabin. The door was wide open. Inside, a table was set for 4 people. The food on the plates, bread and some kind of fruit, looked fresh, as if it had just been served. But when James reached out to touch the bread, it disintegrated into fine gray ash. On the wall of the cabin hung another map. James walked over to it, his heart hammering against his ribs. This map wasn't of the Cascade Range. It was a map of the world, but everything was wrong. The continents were shifted. There was a massive landmass in the middle of the Atlantic, and in the corner of the map, there was a red dot labeled, "You are here." Beside the red dot, there was a list of names. James scanned the list, and his breath stopped. At the very bottom of the list, written in fresh, wet ink, was his own name, James Miller. The escape and the aftermath. Panic took over. James turned and bolted out of the cabin. He didn't follow the trail, he just ran. He scrambled through the canyon, his lungs burning, the bruised purple sky pressing down on him like a physical weight. He burst through the hemlock thicket and collapsed on the forest floor. When he looked up, the sun was shining. The granite wall was back, towering over him, solid and indifferent. He looked at his watch. It was ticking again, but instead of being 2:30 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, it was 4:15 in the morning on a Friday. He had been gone for nearly 2 days, though it felt like 20 minutes. James hiked back to his truck, drove home in a daze, and immediately went to his dining room table to find the 1954 map. He wanted to burn it. He wanted to erase it from existence. But when he unrolled the leather tube, the map was blank. The ink had vanished. The paper was yellowed and brittle as if it were hundreds of years old. The final mystery. James never told anyone the full story until he sat down with a researcher years later. He spent the rest of his life avoiding the mountains. He became obsessed with time, keeping 32 different clocks in his house, all synchronized to the second. But here is the part that defies all logic. 3 years after James's experience, a survey crew was sent into that same area of the Dark Divide to investigate reports of magnetic anomalies. They never found a valley, they never found a basin. However, they did find something at the base of that granite ridge. Wedged into a crack in the rock, 60 feet above the ground, where no human could reach without climbing gear, was a small leather-bound journal. Inside the journal, there was only one page with writing on it. It was a list of names of people who had gone missing in the Pacific Northwest over the last 75 years. And at the very bottom of that list, written in the same shaky 1954 handwriting, was the name of the man who had sold James the map at the estate sale. Beside his name was a single note. He found the way back. I did not. The world is a lot bigger than we think. And the maps we use to navigate it are only as good as the reality we choose to believe in. Sometimes there are places that don't exist on our maps because they aren't meant for us. And if you ever find a map that shows a place that shouldn't be there, do yourself a favor, don't go looking for it. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today, we are going to look at a case that defies every law of physics we hold dear. It is a story about a man who took a routine trip in a machine we use every single day, only to find himself in a place that mathematically and geographically should not exist. The man in the gray suit. The year was 2014, and the setting was a bustling metropolitan area in the heart of the American Midwest. Arthur Vance was a man who lived by the clock. At 54 years old, Arthur was a senior structural engineer for a firm that specialized in the very thing that would eventually become his nightmare: high-rise architecture. Arthur was a man of logic. He believed in blueprints, load-bearing walls, and the unyielding laws of gravity. He was the kind of man who wore a crisp, ironed shirt even on a Saturday and took his coffee black because distractions only cloud the data. He lived in a comfortable, albeit sterile, apartment on the 22nd floor of a prestigious building known as the Willow Creek Towers. On the evening of November 14th, Arthur stayed late at his office to finish a set of seismic calculations. By the time he packed his briefcase and headed for the parking garage, it was nearly 11 o'clock at night. The city was shrouded in a thick, freezing fog that seemed to swallow the streetlights whole. Arthur drove home, his mind still spinning with equations. He pulled into the underground garage of the Willow Creek Towers, parked his sedan in spot number 412, and walked toward the bank of elevators. There were 3 elevators in the lobby. Elevator 1 was out of service for maintenance. Elevator 2 was currently on the 30th floor. Elevator 3, however, was sitting right there on the G level, its brass doors polished to a mirror finish, waiting for him. Arthur stepped inside. The ascent that never ended. The interior of Elevator 3 was lined with mahogany wood panels and smelled faintly of floor wax and ozone. Arthur reached out and pressed the button for the 22nd floor. The button illuminated with a soft amber glow. The doors slid shut with a heavy mechanical thud, and the carriage began to rise. For the first 10 seconds, everything was normal. Arthur felt the familiar, slight pull of gravity against his soles. He watched the digital display above the door. 2, 3, 4. But then, as the display hit 7, the elevator didn't just move, it surged. Arthur later described it as the feeling of being in a jet engine during takeoff. The smooth hum of the cables turned into a low-frequency growl that he could feel in his molars. He reached out to steady himself against the handrail, but as he did, the amber light on the 22nd floor button flickered and went out. In its place, every single button on the panel began to glow a deep, pulsing crimson. Arthur pressed the stop button. Nothing happened. He pressed the alarm button. Silence. He picked up the emergency telephone, the 911 line, but when he put it to his ear, there was no dial tone. There wasn't even static. There was only the sound of a woman breathing on the other end, slow, rhythmic, and incredibly cold. He dropped the receiver, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked back up at the floor indicator. 98, 99, 100. The Willow Creek Towers only had 35 floors, defying every law of logic. Arthur watched in a state of paralyzed shock as the numbers continued to climb. 200, 500, 1,000. The speed was impossible. If the elevator were truly moving that fast, the G-force should have crushed him into a puddle on the floor, yet he felt light, almost weightless. Then the numbers stopped. The display didn't show a digit anymore. It showed a symbol, a horizontal line with a circle beneath it. A symbol Arthur, a career engineer, had never seen in any textbook. The elevator came to a halt. There was no ding, no smooth deceleration, just a sudden, violent stop that threw Arthur against the mahogany wall. The doors didn't open immediately. For 3 minutes, Arthur stood in total darkness as the lights inside the carriage failed. He shouted for help, his voice sounding thin and muffled, as if the air itself had become denser, harder to vibrate. Finally, with a sound like grinding stone, the doors began to slide open. Arthur expected to see a mechanical room or perhaps the roof of the building. He expected to see the night sky over the city. But what he saw when those doors fully retracted was something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The impossible floor. Arthur stepped out not because he wanted to, but because the air inside the elevator had become searingly hot, while the air outside the doors was deathly cold. He found himself standing in a hallway that looked exactly like the one on his own 22nd floor. The same beige carpet, the same sconce lighting, the same gold-leafed room numbers. But there was one terrifying difference. The hallway didn't end. Arthur looked to his left. The corridor stretched out for what looked like miles, narrowing into a single point of perspective in the distance. He looked to his right. It was the same. A perfectly straight, infinite line of identical doors and identical lights. He turned back to the elevator, desperate to get back inside, but the doors had already closed. He pressed the call button repeatedly, but the brass plate was cold and dead. He was stranded. Arthur began to walk. He had no choice. As he passed the doors, he looked at the numbers. They weren't in any logical order. 1, 10,000, 0, -4. He stopped at a door labeled room 212, his own apartment number. With trembling hands, he reached for the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open, expecting to see his living room, his recliner, and his collection of jazz records. Instead, he stepped into a space that defied the very concept of indoors. The room was a vast, open field of gray grass under a sky that was the color of a fresh bruise. There was no sun, no moon, and no stars. Just a flat, oppressive purple light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And standing in the middle of that field, about 50 yards away, was an elevator bank. A single, freestanding structure of chrome and glass rising out of the dirt like a monument. Arthur ran toward it. His shoes thudded against the gray grass, which felt brittle like dried bone. As he reached the elevator, the doors opened automatically. Inside stood a man. He was wearing the same gray suit as Arthur. He had the same briefcase. He had the same black coffee stain on his left cuff from a meeting earlier that morning. The man was Arthur, but he was older, much older. His hair was snow white, and his skin was translucent, like parchment. The other Arthur looked at him with eyes that held a lifetime of sorrow and simply said, "You're early. The calculations aren't finished yet." The descent into reality. Before Arthur could speak, the other Arthur reached out and shoved him. It wasn't a violent shove, but it was firm. Arthur fell backward out of the chrome elevator and back through the door of room 212. He didn't hit the floor of his apartment, he hit the carpet of the infinite hallway. The door slammed shut and vanished, leaving only a blank beige wall. Suddenly, the hallway began to shake. The lights flickered and began to explode one by one, moving toward him like a wave of darkness. Arthur scrambled back toward the original elevator, the one that had brought him here. Miraculously, the doors were open. He dived inside just as the last light in the hallway went out. He didn't press a button. He didn't have to. The elevator began to descend. But it wasn't the violent, high-speed ascent from before. This was a slow, agonizing crawl. He could hear the cables straining, snapping one by one with sounds like pistol shots. 10, 9, 8. The display was working again. Arthur huddled in the corner, sobbing, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in 30 years. When the doors finally opened, the bright, fluorescent light of the Willow Creek Tower's lobby flooded the carriage. Arthur stumbled out, collapsing onto the marble floor. A security guard, a young man named Marcus, whom Arthur knew well, ran over to him. "Mr. Vance, are you okay? Where have you been?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with genuine alarm. Arthur looked up, gasping for air. I got stuck. The elevator. It went too high." Marcus looked at the elevator, then back at Arthur. He looked confused. "Mr. Vance, you just got into that elevator 5 seconds ago. The doors closed, they shook for a second, and then they opened right back up. You never even left the lobby." Arthur shook his head, pointing at his watch. "No, I was up there for hours. Look at the time." He held up his wrist. His watch, a high-end Swiss mechanical piece, was no longer ticking. The hands were spinning wildly in clockwise circles, moving so fast they were a blur. And then Arthur looked down at his hands. When he had entered the elevator, his hands were the hands of a 54-year-old man. Now they were wrinkled, spotted with age, and his fingernails were long and yellowed. He looked into the reflection of the polished brass elevator doors. The man looking back at him wasn't the Arthur Vance who had stayed late to do seismic calculations. It was the man from the field. His hair was white. He had aged 30 years in the span of 5 seconds. The aftermath. Arthur Vance was taken to the hospital that night. The doctors were baffled. They had medical records from his checkup just 2 months prior, showing a man in peak health for his age. Now, they were looking at a man whose cellular degradation suggested he was at least 85 years old. He had developed cataracts, advanced arthritis, and a heart murmur that hadn't existed that morning. The building management at Willow Creek Towers conducted a full forensic investigation of Elevator 3. They brought in the manufacturer, the city inspectors, and even independent consultants. They tore the machine apart piece by piece. They found nothing wrong. No mechanical failure, no electrical surge, no secret floors. However, they did find one thing that they couldn't explain. On the interior of the elevator's ceiling, a place no passenger could reach and where no technician had worked in years, there was a single sentence scratched into the mahogany wood. It looked as though it had been carved with a fingernail. It read, "The sum of the parts is less than the whole of the void." Arthur Vance lived for another 3 days. He died in his sleep at the hospital, his body simply giving out from what the coroner described as extreme accelerated senescence. But the mystery doesn't end with Arthur's death. 6 months later, a new tenant moved into the Willow Creek Towers. A young woman, an architect herself, was taking elevator 3 up to the 12th floor. When the doors opened, she found a small leather briefcase sitting in the center of the elevator floor. She took it to the lost and found. When the security guard, the same Marcus from that night, opened it, he found a set of seismic calculations for a building that hasn't been built yet. The date on the top of the papers wasn't 2014. It was 2044. And the signature at the bottom of the page in fresh, wet ink was Arthur Vance. The closing logic. If you go to the Willow Creek Towers today, you will find that Elevator 3 is permanently boarded up. The management claims it's due to structural concerns regarding the elevator shaft. But if you talk to the night guards, the ones who have been there a long time, they will tell you a different story. They will tell you that late at night, when the building is quiet and the fog rolls in from the lake, you can hear the sound of an elevator moving. You can hear the hum of the cables and the ding of a floor being reached. But the most chilling part isn't the sound of the machine, it's the sound that comes afterward. They say that if you stand close enough to the boarded up doors of Elevator 3, you can hear the sound of a man's voice, thin, old, and tired, whispering through the wood. He isn't asking for help. He isn't screaming. He's just counting. 1001, 1002, 1003. Waiting for a floor that doesn't exist to finally open its doors. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because today, we are going to look at a case that defies every law of physics, every pillar of logic, and every ounce of common sense that we use to navigate our daily lives. This is a story about a man named Elias Thorne, a piece of technology that should not have functioned, and a series of images that quite literally should not exist in our reality. The man who liked the silence. Elias Thorne was 62 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades, he had lived a life defined by solitude and precision. Elias was a retired surveyor for the United States Forest Service, a man who had spent his career mapping the most rugged, unforgiving corners of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. When you spend that much time in the deep woods, in places where the moss grows so thick it swallows the sound of your own footsteps, you develop a certain relationship with the world. You learn that nature is not just trees and dirt, it is a living, breathing entity that occasionally likes to keep secrets. Elias lived in a small, hand-built cabin about 20 miles outside of Port Angeles. He was a man of routine. He woke up at 5 in the morning, brewed a pot of black coffee, and spent his afternoons as an amateur wildlife photographer. But Elias was not looking for pretty pictures of deer to put on a calendar. He was obsessed with the unseen. He wanted to capture the moments when nature thought no one was watching. To do this, he utilized high-end, motion-activated trail cameras, devices designed to withstand the harshest elements and trigger at the slightest hint of movement. In the late autumn of 2024, Elias decided to venture into an area known locally as the Gray Shallows. It was a valley that did not appear on most tourist maps because, frankly, there was no reason for a tourist to go there. The terrain was a nightmare of jagged limestone and widowmakers, which are dead trees leaning precariously against their neighbors, waiting for a gust of wind to bring them crashing down. It was a place where global positioning system signals went to die, and where the fog seemed to settle into the earth like a heavy, wet blanket. The discovery in the shallows. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Elias was scouting for a new location to mount his latest camera, a top-of-the-line Apex Sentinel, he spotted something caught in the roots of a massive, upended Sitka spruce. At first, he thought it was just a piece of rusted logging equipment from the early 1900s, but as he climbed down into the muddy depression, he realized it was a camera. Now, this was not one of his cameras. It was an old, heavy, metallic box, roughly the size of a toaster. It looked like a prototype from the late 1970s or early 1980s, but there were no brand names on it. No Nikon, no Canon, no Bushnell. Just a series of hand-etched numbers on the side, 00149. The casing was pitted and scarred, covered in a strange iridescent film that felt oily to the touch. Despite the fact that it looked like it had been buried in the muck for 30 years, the lens, a thick, bulging piece of glass, was crystal clear. Not a single scratch, not a speck of dirt. It looked back at Elias like a cold, unblinking eye. Elias took the device back to his cabin. He was curious, but he was also a professional. He knew that electronics left in the damp Pacific Northwest for decades usually turned into a corroded mess of copper and plastic. But when he got it under the bright lights of his workbench and managed to pry open the back panel, he did not find a film reel or a standard secure digital card. He found a single, solid block of a black, glass-like material. It had no ports, no pins, and no obvious way to interface with a computer. And yet, as he touched the black block, a small screen on the back of the camera, a screen that should not have had any power, flickered to life. The first recording. The backward rain. Elias sat back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a man of science, a man of measurements. He told himself there must be a long-life lithium battery buried deep inside the casing. But as the screen stabilized, he saw a playback menu. There was only one file recorded on the device. The timestamp at the bottom of the screen read December 31st, 9999. Elias chuckled nervously. "Glitch in the software," he muttered to the empty room. He pressed the play button. The footage started with a burst of static that sounded like human whispering played at triple speed. Then the image cleared. The camera was positioned in the exact same spot where Elias had found it, the roots of the Sitka spruce. But the forest looked different. The trees were not spruce or fir, they were towering, fern-like structures that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent purple light. In the frame, it was raining, but the rain was not falling from the sky. The droplets were rising from the ground, hovering for a split second in midair, and then accelerating upward into a sky that was the color of a fresh bruise. Elias leaned in closer. He looked for signs of a hoax, like computer-generated imagery or a prank by some tech-savvy hikers, but the lighting was too perfect. The way the light refracted through the upward-moving water was physically flawless. As he watched, a creature moved across the background. It was roughly the size of a black bear, but it moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of a stop-motion animation. It had too many limbs, and as it walked, it left footprints in the air that stayed glowing for several seconds before fading. The second minute, the observer. The footage was 10 minutes long. By the 3-minute mark, the camera's perspective began to shift, even though the device was clearly stationary. It was as if the space around the camera was warping. The trees began to melt like wax, flowing into one another until the landscape was a flat, shimmering plain of obsidian. Then, a figure appeared. It started as a pinprick of white light in the center of the frame. Slowly, it grew larger, walking toward the lens. As it got closer, Elias felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The figure was a man. He was wearing a Forest Service uniform, the exact same olive drab jacket and wide-brimmed hat that Elias had worn for 30 years. The man on the screen stopped 10 feet from the camera. He turned his head, and Elias let out a choked gasp. The man was Elias, but not the Elias Thorne, who was 62 years old. It was an Elias Thorne who looked to be perhaps 100 years old. His skin was like translucent parchment, and his eyes were not eyes at all. They were twin voids of swirling golden dust. The Elias on the screen did not look into the lens. He looked through it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic box, the same box Elias was holding in his hands right now. The elderly Elias knelt down and placed the camera into the roots of a tree that had not grown yet. But here is where the logic of our universe breaks. As the man on the screen set the camera down, the background behind him began to cycle through time at an impossible velocity. Elias watched as the seasons blurred into a brown and white smear. He watched the massive spruce tree rot into nothing in a matter of seconds, and then saw a tiny sapling sprout and grow into a giant in the span of a breath. The man remained stationary, unaffected by the thousands of years passing around him. He leaned forward, his face inches from the lens, and he spoke. There was no audio, but Elias Thorne knew exactly what was being said. He could read his own lips perfectly. The man said, "Do not look at the final frame." The defiance of logic. Elias should have stopped the video. Every instinct honed over 6 decades of survival told him to take the camera, drive to the middle of the Elwha River Bridge, and hurl it into the freezing water below. But curiosity is a heavy weight, and Elias was a man who had spent his life trying to see what was not meant to be seen. He let the video play. At the 8-minute mark, the footage stopped being a recording of a place and began to look like a recording of everything. The screen split into thousands of tiny subframes. In one, Elias saw his own birth in 1962. In another, he saw his father's funeral in 1998. In a third, he saw himself sitting at his workbench at this very moment, watching the screen. He turned his head sharply, looking over his shoulder. The cabin was empty. The door was locked. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the heavy thud of his own heart. But on the screen, the version of him sitting at the workbench turned his head at the exact same millisecond. The Elias on the screen then did something Elias did not do. The screen Elias reached out and touched the monitor. Elias Thorne felt a cold physical pressure on the back of his hand. He looked down. There was no one there. But on the screen, he could see the fingers of his future, or past, self-pressing against his skin. The subframes began to merge, collapsing back into a single image. The timestamp was now flickering wildly, counting down from 100 to 0. 90, 80, 70. The image on the screen was no longer the forest, it was a view of the Earth from deep space. But the Earth was different. It was cracked, like a dry marble, and a great eye, an eye so large it dwarfed the moon, was peering through the center of the planet. It was not a biological eye. It was made of gears, clockwork, and screaming faces. The final frame. Elias reached for the power button. His hand was shaking so violently he knocked a jar of nails off his workbench. They hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Clatter. He missed the button. The countdown hit 10. 10, 9, 8. He lunged for the black block, intending to rip it out of the casing. But the block was no longer solid. It had become a liquid, a swirling pool of midnight that began to pour over his fingers. It was not cold, and it was not hot. It felt like nothing. It felt like the absence of touch. 7, 6, 5. The image on the screen zoomed in. It zoomed past the great eye, past the gears, past the screaming faces, and into a single dark room. In that room, there was a pedestal, and on that pedestal sat a human heart. It was still beating, but it was not pumping blood, it was pumping light. Each time the heart contracted, a new star appeared in the background of the frame. Each time it expanded, a star went dark. 4, 3, 2. Elias screamed. He did not scream because he was afraid of death. He screamed because he realized the heart on the screen was his. He could feel the rhythm of the stars in his own chest. He was the engine of the universe, and the engine was failing. 1. The screen went white. Not a digital white, but a white so bright it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eyeballs. Elias felt himself being pulled not toward the camera, but into himself. The cabin, the trees, the Olympic Peninsula, the entire state of Washington, it all folded inward like a piece of paper being crumpled by a giant hand. The aftermath. On Wednesday morning, a neighbor named Miller, who lived about 2 miles down the road, noticed that Elias's chimney was not smoking. This was unusual. Elias was a man of habit, and the November air was biting. Miller walked up the trail to the cabin and knocked on the door. No answer. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. When Miller stepped inside, he found the cabin exactly as it should be. The coffee pot was cold, but half full. The jar of nails was overturned on the floor. Elias Thorne was nowhere to be found. But sitting on the workbench was a camera. It was a rusted, metallic box with the numbers 00149 etched into the side. Miller, being a curious man himself, picked up the camera. He noticed it felt unusually light, almost as if it were hollow. He turned it over in his hands and saw a small screen on the back. It was dark. He pressed a button. The screen flickered to life. There was one file on the device. The timestamp read November 14th, 2026. That was tomorrow's date. Miller pressed play. The footage was a single static shot of the interior of the cabin. In the center of the frame was Miller himself standing at the workbench holding the camera. In the video, Miller looked confused. He looked around the room just as the real Miller was doing at that very second. But in the video, behind Miller, a door that led to the cellar, a door that Miller knew was bolted shut, slowly began to creak open. In the real cabin, Miller heard the bolt slide back. He did not turn around. He could not. His eyes were locked on the screen of the camera. On the display, he saw a hand reach out from the darkness of the cellar. It was a hand with translucent skin, like parchment. It reached for Miller's shoulder. The real Miller felt a cold, dry palm press against his jacket. And then the camera's battery died. When the local sheriff arrived 3 hours later, the cabin was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry. The only thing they found was a trail camera sitting on the workbench. When the forensic team tried to power it on, they found that the interior of the camera was completely empty. No wires, no motherboards, no battery. It was just an empty metal box with a lens made of common glass. Elias Thorne and Miller were never seen again. Some say they are still out there in the gray shallows, caught in a loop of time that refuses to let them go. Others say that some things are recorded not because they happened, but because the act of recording them makes them happen. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the Pacific Northwest and you see an old rusted box tucked into the roots of a tree, do yourself a favor, leave it there. Because some things are meant to be seen by the woods, and the woods alone. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Today's story involves a man of logic, a house with a hidden history, and a physical impossibility that defied every law of physics known to man. The man of solid ground. To understand how truly impossible this story is, you first have to understand the man it happened to. Arthur Penhaligon was 64 years old in the year 2022. Arthur was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was not a man who watched ghost hunting shows or believed in urban legends. In fact, for 40 years, Arthur had made his living as a structural engineer in the city of Boston. He was the kind of man who looked at a skyscraper and did not see a monument to human achievement. He saw a complex series of load-bearing calculations, wind shear resistances, and geological stability reports. His entire world was built on the back of mathematics, reinforced steel, and the absolute certainty of blueprints. If a wall was there, it was there for a reason. If a foundation was cracking, there was a geological explanation for it. In Arthur's world, 2 plus 2 always equaled 4, and doors did not simply appear out of thin air. He was a widower, his wife having passed away 5 years prior, and he found solace in the rigid, predictable laws of the physical world. In the autumn of 2022, Arthur decided it was finally time to retire. He wanted to get away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of safety inspections. He purchased a home in the rural outskirts of western Massachusetts near a small, quiet town called Oak Haven. The house was a massive, sprawling Victorian built in the late 1800s. It was a fixer-upper, as they say, but for a man with Arthur's skills, it was the perfect project to keep his mind sharp during his golden years. He relished the idea of stripping back the decades of neglect to find the solid bones of the structure underneath. The layout of the second floor. The house sat on 22 acres of dense woodland, mostly oak and pine, that seemed to crowd in on the property as if trying to reclaim it. It was a 3-story structure with a wraparound porch and a cellar that smelled of damp earth and old coal. But the focus of our story is the second floor hallway. Now, picture this hallway. It was long, narrow, and lined with dark mahogany paneling that had grown dim with age. On the left side of the hallway, there were 3 doors leading to bedrooms. On the right side, there was only a solid, unbroken wall of brick and plaster. The reason that right side wall was solid was simple. It was the exterior of the massive central chimney stack that ran from the massive cast iron furnace in the basement all the way up through the center of the house and out the roof. Arthur had spent 3 weeks personally stripping the faded floral wallpaper from that hallway. He knew every inch of it. He had measured the thickness of the walls to ensure they could handle the weight of the new light fixtures he planned to install. He had checked the structural integrity of the chimney, even going so far as to use a borescope camera to inspect the internal flue. He knew for a fact that behind that right-hand wall was 16 inches of solid antique red brick. There was no void, there was no hidden closet, there was only the heavy, silent, and very much solid heart of the house. The first Tuesday in November. The events began on the first Tuesday of November. Arthur woke up at exactly 6:45 in the morning, just as he had done for 4 decades. The routine was his anchor. He made himself a pot of black coffee, watched the thick morning fog roll over the Berkshire Hills from his kitchen window, and then headed upstairs to continue his renovations. He was currently working on refinishing the floorboards in the main hallway. As he reached the top of the stairs and turned into the second floor hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks. His coffee mug nearly slipped from his hand, the hot liquid splashing slightly against his thumb, but he did not even feel the sting. There, on the right side of the hallway, the side that should have been solid brick, was a door. It was not a modern door. It was a heavy, ornate door made of dark walnut with a tarnished brass handle and an old-fashioned skeleton key lock. It was set perfectly into the wall, with molding that matched the rest of the 19th century woodwork so perfectly it looked as if it had been there for 100 years. Arthur stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, just staring. His mind, the mind of a professional engineer, began to race. He thought he must be having a stroke or perhaps some form of late-onset dementia. He checked his vision, rubbing his eyes until they were red. He looked back down the stairs, then back at the door. It did not disappear. It was physical. It was real. It cast a shadow on the floorboards he had just sanded the day before. He walked up to it and placed his hand on the wood. It was ice cold, colder than the rest of the house, which was kept at a comfortable 68 degrees. He knocked on the door. Instead of the dull, muffled thud of a door leading to a brick-filled closet, he heard a hollow, echoing sound as if there was a vast, empty space on the other side. This was a physical impossibility. Behind that door should be the central chimney. If he were to walk through that door, he should be standing inside a column of solid, soot-stained brick. The investigation. Arthur did what any rational man would do. He went to the basement to get his tools. He grabbed his heavy-duty sledgehammer, a high-lumen flashlight, and a set of blueprints he had sketched himself after measuring the house. He was determined to find the trick. Perhaps there was a secret compartment he had missed, but 16 inches of brick does not just move. He returned to the hallway, half expecting the door to be gone, but it was still there, standing silent and imposing against the mahogany. He took his measuring tape and measured from the top of the stairs to the door, 7 feet, 4 inches. Then he went into the bedroom on the opposite side of the wall and measured the interior dimensions of the chimney stack from that side. The math did not work. The door was occupying a space that, according to the laws of geometry and the physical constraints of the house, simply did not exist. He reached for the brass handle. It was frozen solid. He turned it with all his might, his knuckles turning white, but it would not budge. It felt as though the door was not just locked, but fused to the frame. Then he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. From the bottom gap of the door, the tiny space between the dark wood and the floorboards, a faint, rhythmic sound was coming. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a heartbeat. A very slow, very heavy heartbeat that seemed to vibrate in Arthur's own chest. Arthur backed away, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He spent the rest of the day in his living room on the first floor with a loaded shotgun across his lap. He did not believe in ghosts, but he did believe in intruders, and he could not rule out that some master carpenter had played an elaborate, impossible prank on him while he was sleeping. He stayed awake, watching the clock on the mantel. The midnight change. That night, Arthur could not sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the house creak in the wind. Every sound was magnified. Every groan of the timber felt like a footstep. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Creak! It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy door swinging open on ungreased hinges. It was loud, echoing through the empty house like a scream. Arthur grabbed his flashlight and his shotgun and ran to the hallway. He rounded the corner, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The door was wide open. He shone his light into the doorway, fully expecting to see the red brick of the chimney or perhaps a dusty, forgotten closet. Instead, the beam of his light went out and out and out. The light did not hit a back wall. It did not hit a floor. On the other side of that door was a forest. Arthur stepped closer, his knees shaking so violently he had to lean against the doorframe. He stood in the doorway of his second-floor hallway and looked out into a moonlit woods that looked nothing like the Massachusetts landscape. The trees were massive, with white bark that seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence and leaves that looked like silver coins. The air that wafted into his hallway did not smell like old wood or dust. It smelled like ozone, damp moss, and something metallic, like a copper penny on the tongue. There was no sky, at least not one he recognized. Above the silver trees was a swirling expanse of violet and deep gray clouds that moved with a terrifying speed. And then he saw the footprints. Leading from the forest, across the threshold of the walnut door and onto his hallway carpet were wet, muddy footprints. They were large, significantly larger than a man's, and they had only 4 toes. They were fresh. The mud was still glistening in the light of his flashlight. They led right up to where Arthur was standing, and then they simply stopped. The confrontation. Arthur felt a presence behind him. It was not a sound, but a sudden, violent change in the air pressure, the way your ears pop when a plane descends too quickly. A heaviness settled over the hallway, a weight so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. He turned around slowly, swinging his flashlight in a wide arc. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there but the shadows and his own terrified reflection in a mirror at the end of the hall. But when he turned back to the door, it was closing. He lunged for the handle, driven by a desperate, panicked need to see where that forest went, to understand how a door could lead to another world from the middle of a brick chimney. But as his hand touched the wood, the door slammed shut with the force of a gale wind. The sound was deafening. It was not the sound of wood hitting wood, it was the sound of a mountain cracking. It echoed through the house like a cannon blast, shattering the glass in the light fixtures and knocking Arthur backward. He hit the opposite wall and slumped to the floor, his ears ringing. When he looked up, the door was gone. Not just closed, not just hidden, gone. Where the walnut door had been seconds before, there was only the solid, mahogany-paneled wall. He scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling so much he dropped his flashlight. He began tearing at the wood with his bare hands, his fingernails bleeding as he clawed at the paneling. He grabbed his sledgehammer and swung it with everything he had left in his body. The hammer hit the wall and rebounded with a bone-jarring vibration that nearly broke his wrists. He had hit solid brick. He swung again and again, screaming in frustration and terror, until he had smashed through the mahogany paneling and the plaster behind it. There, revealed in the flickering light of his fallen flashlight, was the red brick of the chimney. It was dry, covered in a century of dust, and completely, utterly solid. There was no room for a door, there was no room for a forest, there was only the cold, hard reality of the house. The aftermath. Arthur Penhaligon did not stay in that house another night. He did not even wait for the sun to come up. He threw a few bags into his car and drove to a motel in town where he sat in the lobby until the manager arrived at 7 in the morning. He stayed there until he could arrange for a moving crew to pack up his things. But here is the part of the story that truly defies logic, the part that keeps Arthur awake in the middle of the night. When the movers arrived 3 days later to help Arthur take his belongings out of the house, they found him standing in the second-floor hallway staring at the floor. He had not gone back inside until he was accompanied by 4 large men. The movers asked him what was wrong. Arthur did not speak. He simply pointed to the carpet. There, dried into the fabric of the expensive rug he had bought just a month prior, were 3 large muddy footprints. Each footprint had only 4 toes. They were perfectly preserved, a physical testament to something that should not exist. Arthur took a sample of that mud, he scraped it into a glass jar and sent it to a laboratory at the University of Massachusetts. He did not tell them the truth of where it came from, he just asked for a detailed analysis of the soil composition and any organic matter within it. 2 weeks later, he received a phone call from a very confused geologist at the university. The geologist told him that the soil sample was an anomaly. It contained a high concentration of minerals that were not found anywhere in the New England area. In fact, they were not found anywhere on the North American continent. The closest match for the soil composition was from a remote region in the Ural Mountains of Russia, but even then, there were organic compounds in the mud pollen from trees and spores from fungi that the university could not identify as belonging to any known species on Earth. The geologist asked Arthur where he had found it. Arthur hung up the phone. Arthur Penhaligon sold the house at a massive loss, nearly $200,000 less than he had paid for it. He did not care about the money. He moved into a small, modern apartment in the heart of Boston, a place made of glass and reinforced steel, a place with no history, no chimneys, and a place where every door led exactly where it was supposed to lead. He never spoke of the event to his friends or his grown children, fearing they would think his mind had finally succumbed to age and the grief of losing his wife. But every night before he goes to sleep in his sterile, brightly lit apartment, Arthur does something. He takes a piece of blue painter's tape and he marks the floor in front of every door in his home. He marks the closet, the bathroom, and the front entrance. He wants to see if the tape is broken in the morning. He wants to see if anything has come through while he was dreaming. Because even though the walnut door is gone and the brick is solid once again, Arthur knows one thing for certain. In the world of the strange, dark, and mysterious, just because you can't see the door anymore doesn't mean it isn't still there, waiting for the clock to strike 3:17 in the morning.